You think US agriculture is a single story. It isn't. Right now, America is living inside two agricultures at the same time. One looks fine on paper. Farm income near nominal record highs for 2025. Land values still climbing. Credit conditions generally good. Bankruptcies up, but still a handful. Debt to assets low by historical standards. And the other, the one farmers feel in their chest. Prices falling for row crops like corn, wheat, soybeans, input costs, energy, fertilizer still stubbornly high, cash margins squeezed until profit becomes a memory. That's why you hear the panic. That's why you hear the anger. And then comes the twist. A sector that's supposedly reeling is also staring at up to $35 billion in expected government payments in 2025, not even counting another $12 billion expected in 2026. So here's the question you and I have to face. Is this a farm crisis or a credibility crisis? Because in trade wars, agriculture isn't the headline. It's the collateral. If you want analysis like this, straight, cinematic, no fluff, subscribe, because what's happening to farmers today is what eventually hits your grocery bill tomorrow. And one more thing, the most dangerous part isn't the short-term price drop. It's the long-term habit the world builds when America stops looking like a reliable supplier. That's where this story really begins. Because to understand US agriculture right now, you have to understand the disconnect first. And why it's getting worse. The disconnect isn't accidental. It's structural. On one side, Washington looks at agriculture through aggregates, total income, total assets, total debt, a bird's eye view that says the system is holding. On the other side, farmers live inside margins. What comes in today, what goes out tomorrow. What's left, if anything, at the end of the season. That difference matters because when policymakers say the sector is strong, they're often including billions in government payments. When farmers say we're struggling, they're talking about cash. Market prices versus input costs. Sales versus survival. And then trade enters the picture. Tariffs don't hit spreadsheets evenly. They hit specific crops, specific regions, specific months of the year. Soybeans don't get a second chance when a market disappears. Neither does sorghum or cotton or specialty crops pulled quietly off foreign shelves. So the real question isn't whether US agriculture is healthy. It's who inside agriculture is carrying the risk and why policy keeps masking that risk instead of resolving it. To see how we got here, we have to rewind to prices, to cycles, and to the moment the system quietly changed. The story really begins before the trade wars. Before the bailouts, before the shouting, it begins with a cycle. In 2022, global agricultural prices surged. Row crops hit levels farmers hadn't seen in years. Revenue spiked. Balance sheets looked strong. For a brief moment, the system felt generous again. But cycles don't freeze at the top. After 2022, prices fell fast. Corn, wheat, soybeans, all sliding back, and in some cases, below pre-2022 levels. That part is normal. Commodity markets always correct. What wasn't normal was what didn't fall with them. Energy costs stayed high. Fertilizer prices retreated only partially. Land rents didn't come down. Debt service didn't get cheaper. So farmers found themselves in a new kind of squeeze, selling at yesterday's prices, paying tomorrow's costs. At the same time, something else was shifting quietly. Livestock and dairy moved in the opposite direction. Meat prices stayed high. Feed costs, corn and soy fell. Margins widened instead of collapsing. So agriculture split, row crops absorbed the shock. Livestock captured the upside, and national statistics blended the two into a story that felt calm, even as half the sector felt cornered. That's the background. the economic terrain, which meant when trade conflict arrived, it didn't hit a stable system. It hit a stressed one. Then came the first shock, not theoretical, not abstract. Immediate, when tariffs hit, agriculture didn't wait for a long-term study. Markets reacted in real time. China announced counter-retaliatory tariffs. Prices moved within hours. Soybeans fell. Sorghum followed. Cotton, meats, specialty crops pulled into the same gravity. This wasn't just about losing a buyer. China wasn't a market. It was the market. For years, the largest agricultural importer in the world, the anchor customer for US exports. So when that door narrowed, the cost showed up fast. Lower prices at the farm gate, inventories backing up, basis levels weakening in inland regions. Washington responded the only way it could cash. First, market facilitation payments, then supplemental assistance. Billions to cushion the blow. And for a moment, it worked. The pain dulled, the headlines softened, the system stayed upright. But here's what bailouts don't fix. They don't preserve markets, they don't protect trust, and they don't stop competitors from moving in. While US producers waited, others expanded. Brazil increased production, South America filled the gap. Supply chains rewired themselves quietly, efficiently, permanently. If you care about where this is going, this is the moment to pay attention. Because the real damage of a trade war doesn't show up in year one. It shows up when the buyer doesn't come back. What looks like chaos on the surface actually follows a hidden logic. Trade wars don't just block flows, they redirect them. When the United States loses access to a market, the product doesn't vanish. It floods somewhere else. And that somewhere else reacts. Third countries see the surge. They feel the pressure, and eventually they protect themselves with tariffs of their own. This is how fragmentation spreads. Not by design, by chain reaction. We've seen this movie before. In the 1,930 seconds, cascading barriers collapsed, global trade. Today, the warning signs are quieter but familiar. Steel, aluminum. Now agriculture, and beneath it all sits a fragile assumption that markets remember. They don't, they adapt. China didn't just retaliate. It diversified. Brazil scaled up. Infrastructure followed, ports, logistics, routes that bypass US choke points. Once those systems exist, they don't get dismantled out of goodwill. Meanwhile, the US response leaned heavily on income support. Billions flowed in. Farm income looked strong again. But that strength came from policy, not prices. And that's the danger. When income depends less on markets and more on payments, signals get distorted. Land values rise, entry barriers harden. Younger farmers get priced out. Absentee ownership grows. The system survives, but it drifts. And when drift sets in, the next shock hits harder than the last. Then came the second pressure point. Quieter, more personal, and harder to ignore. Because while markets were shifting globally, life at home was changing too. Land values kept rising, not because farming got easier, but because capital got cheaper then scarcer, and farmland became a store of value. To older farmers, rising land prices looked like security. To younger ones, they looked like a locked door. Production value stopped mattering. Cash flow stopped justifying loans. Owning land became less about what it produced and more about what it represented. And then absentee ownership entered the frame. Investors, funds, people who didn't live there, didn't farm there, didn't plan to pass anything down. Some land stayed in production. Some didn't. Some moved into conservation easements, mitigation credits, carbon narratives. To some, that felt like progress. To others, it felt like a false economy, competing with people who actually make their living from the land. At the same time, communities changed. Farms became housing. Pastures became developments. Agriculture didn't disappear, but it thinned. And all of this happened while policymakers pointed to national income numbers and said, see, the sector is fine. That's when the tension peaked, because the crisis wasn't just economic anymore. It was generational, cultural, and quietly existential. This is where it stops being abstract and starts becoming about you, because when agriculture shifts like this, you don't feel it as a farmer first. You feel it as a consumer, as a neighbor, as a family trying to make ends meet. Food prices rise and they don't come back down. Not really. Eggs spike, then fall. But the grocery bill never returns to what it was. Eating out costs more. Living costs more. And for lower income families, food takes a bigger share of everything. What you're seeing isn't just inflation. It's structure. Wages rise slowly. Prices rise faster, and agriculture sits at the front of that pressure chain. At the same time, rural communities hollow out. Young farmers can't buy land. Generational farms become balance sheet assets. And the people who still work the land depend more on policy than markets. That's a dangerous place for any system to land. If you care about food security, about affordability, about whether your country can still feed itself without constant emergency payments, this matters. This is the moment to pay attention, because once agriculture becomes a permanent bailout sector, it stops being resilient. If this analysis helps you see what's really happening, share it, because these decisions don't stay on farms. They end up on your table, and to understand where this pressure leads next, you have to zoom out to the world. Zooming out changes everything, because US agriculture doesn't exist in isolation. It's embedded in geopolitics now, whether farmers ask for it or not. When exports fall, competitors don't pause. They expand. Brazil didn't just replace US soybeans in China. It restructured the flow ports, routes, seasonal dominance. Once that infrastructure locks in, market share doesn't magically revert. Canada feels the shock differently, not always through tariffs, but through behavior. Shelves empty, consumers boycott. Wine, beer, spirits quietly vanish from their largest export market. No press conference, just loss, and this is how trade wars spread. Not with one big collapse, but with dozens of small reroutes, each one rational, each one permanent. The result is a global system that grows more fragmented. Supply chains get shorter. Redundancy replaces efficiency. Resilience becomes the new buzzword. But resilience costs money. For the US, the risk isn't just losing sales. It's losing reputation. Markets don't ask if your politics changed. They ask one question: can we count on you next season? If the answer feels uncertain, buyers diversify away. And once they do, they rarely come back at scale. That's the global impact. Not collapse, but erosion. And erosion sets the stage for what comes next. So what happens next depends on choices, not headlines. From here, there are three paths. None of them are clean. The first is the optimistic path. Trade tensions ease, markets stabilize, the US reasserts itself not through tariffs, but through reliability. Payments shrink back to a safety net instead of a lifeline. Prices recover just enough for margins to breathe. Not a boom, but balance. The second path is muddling through. Trade friction becomes permanent background noise. Government support stays high. Markets function, but never fully heal. Land values stay elevated. Entry barriers harden. Agriculture survives, but more concentrated, more financialized, less forgiving. Then there's the third path. The dangerous one: fragmentation accelerates. Markets close faster than new ones open. Buyers diversify away from the US as a rule, not an exception. Support payments grow not because policymakers want them to, but because they have no alternative. Agriculture becomes strategically dependent, stable on paper. fragile underneath. Here's the uncomfortable truth. None of these outcomes hinge on yields, or technology, or even global demand. They hinge on trust, on whether the world believes the US will show up this season, next season, and the one after that. That belief, once lost, is the hardest thing to rebuild. And that brings us to the final question. What kind of agricultural power does America want to be? Here's the insight that ties everything together. US agriculture doesn't fail loudly. It erodes quietly. Not because farmers stop producing, but because markets stop believing. What you've seen in this story isn't a collapse, it's a substitution. Markets replaced by payments. Signals replaced by support. Reliability replaced by politics. And that's the risk. Because once agriculture depends on emergency money to function, every future shock gets bigger. Every trade dispute gets sharper. Every policy mistake costs more to undo. This isn't about nostalgia, or blaming farmers, or romanticizing the past. It's about a choice, a system built on markets that reward reliability, or a system held together by checks that hide fragility. If you care about food prices, if you care about rural communities, if you care about whether the US can still compete without writing another bailout, then this isn't someone else's issue. It's yours. Because agriculture sits upstream of everything you consume.